Hi, welcome to Conversations. I'm Isaac Benezra, associate producer and host. Today we have the opportunity to meet the person who's following John Musante into an important position in our town. And as I said to Sandy Pooler, it's a tough act to follow. So Sandy Pooler is our new finance director, and he's now in the Conversations hot seat. He's been warned.
Great.
Seriously, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sandy, let the community know, have some idea of what brought you to this position, the kinds of things that you've been doing, and some of the ideas that you have for the future.
Sure. I've been working in government now for about 20 years. Most recently, I was working for the city of Newton as first the city's chief budget officer, and then I was the chief administrative officer for the mayor. I was basically his chief of staff. So during that period, I dealt with a lot of the things that cities and towns deal with, whether it's the challenges of Prop 2.5 and putting budgets together, or collective bargaining, or having adequate capital planning, making sure our buildings were green, a whole array of things. I knew John Musante from my experience working with the Government Finance Officers Association, which is a group of finance people from different cities and towns around the state. John and I, at various times, were president of that organization. So I got to know him personally. And when he was promoted to the position of town manager, he reached out to me and said the finance position, director position was open. Would I be interested? And I jumped at the chance because I know and like John. So having a good boss is an important thing. But also, I knew that Amherst has a deserved reputation for being well-run financially, so I'd be coming into a good situation, and in fact, that's proven to be the case.
Well, we're excited to have you. What's different about Newtown and Amherst in terms of the challenge?
Well,
in terms of government, the
sure.
structure, and how does that work for you now?
Newton was a city with a mayor, kind of very hierarchical structure. Amherst obviously is a town meeting, select board, and so forth. So I've had to learn all about how a town works and the relationships between different people in town. And I think particularly in a town, those relationships I'm learning are very important. Communication is key, meeting face-to-face with people, having an openness and transparency in what the government does, because I think people here in Amherst in particular feel very close to their government and feel that they really want to have a say in what goes on here. So it's been very interesting to watch that process, to sit through town meeting, which was an entirely new experience for me, but also just dealing with the finance committee or the select board or some of the other volunteer committees. I've been very, very impressed with how people speak with each other. I don't know if this is always the case here, but it definitely seems to be the case now that there's a level of respect, a willingness of town leaders to listen to each other, even if they disagree on something, but to do it in a respectful way, and that's been very nice to see.
Well, that's the good part of Amherst, and there is no bad part. We're such a makeup of so many different points of view. If there are 100 people in a room, there are 150 different points of view.
Right.
So it's a challenge, isn't it?
It definitely is a challenge, and it was very interesting to see, again, particularly at town meeting, a wide variety of voices. I'm just learning about how those voices play out, and the role of the majority versus people who have something to say. But it was very respectful, I thought. Usually moved along pretty well, although sometimes you get kind of bogged down in things.
Well, that doesn't happen with mayors, right?
No. Well, people are people. And what government is all about is dealing with people. So whether those people are in town meeting or a select board, or they're on a city council or a mayor, you always have the dynamic of people coming and grappling with difficult fiscal or social issues. I mean, if all these issues were easy, anybody could do it, right? But I think it really speaks to the willingness of people who volunteer their time on these committees or run for town meeting to come out and grapple with tough issues. And sometimes in order to do that, you need to have some space to have conversation go back and forth. I think it's very important as a government official to try to provide information so that people aren't arguing about the information, they're only arguing about policy. So I take very seriously the role of trying to provide accurate numbers and to have the backup so that if people have questions, they can look behind the budget and see what's going on there. So that then really you can have a discussion about values and priorities and those kind of issues. But yeah, as I said, any institution with people, it's always going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I am glad you brought up the issue of having the space. That spells an open door policy. Is that what you're doing?
Well, yeah, I think Amherst has a very open door policy. I know I've met with a lot of town residents. I see John do it all the time. And I've also had the experience, just after a finance committee meeting or a town meeting, just people coming up and asking a question. And I think that's great. I'm always glad to provide information and answer people's questions.
You talked about having the right numbers, but it's not just having the right numbers, it's presenting it in a way that it's part of a process where there was participation, not only town committees, but to the extent possible, the public.
Mm-hmm.
How would you handle that aspect? You said that you would have an open door and welcome people. Isn't that limiting in terms of your time?
Well, sure, there are so many hours in a day, but I haven't found it burdensome so far. I do think the town makes good use of meetings. The town website, I think, is terrific. But it's also, I think, how you format information. You can have numbers in a big table that you need to be an accountant to understand. That's not the kind of transparency that I think is really good. Good narrative descriptions, graphs, and so forth. So putting that out in a number of different ways, because not everybody has time to come to a meeting. Sometimes they're going to get their information from ECTV, sometimes from the paper. I think the town has a good relationship with the press, and that's really important. And I also think when you present information, it can't be static. There has to be historical context. Where have we come from in our budget development over the years? How have we used, for example, the issue of reserves is always a big question for people. And why do we keep reserves? And are they at an adequate level? Should they go up or down? And that's really, I think, only something you can understand if you look at it within a historic context and think about how it then fits into where you want to go in the future.
Talking about the future, we have partners in the future, the state, the federal government, the employees in our town, the community itself. One of the big areas of concern is always at budget time, what will the state come up with?
That's right.
You want to talk about what the towns, officials in the town and community members can do to advance the issue of commitment to schools, commitment to public infrastructure, and because there's a big gap. Because what happens is that we've got a tremendous responsibility every year in terms of our budgets and our tax structure, but we're also one of the determining factors is what is the relationship between the town and the state. what is the relationship between the state and the federal government?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you, as one of the leaders in the state, in terms of a finance director, meet? Do you meet with other finance directors to discuss policy issues that emanate from the select boards of the towns?
I do meet with officials from other towns. Mostly that is around issues of trying to solve common problems, because there's nothing like talking to somebody with experience about how they have dealt with things, trying to make government as efficient as possible. I think the whole issue of the distribution of resources between towns and state and federal government, that gets to be highly political. There is, I think, the towns, particularly through the Mass Municipal Association, do a great job of advocating for the towns. The legislative delegation here, Senator Rosenberg and Representative Story have been strong advocates for state aid to cities and towns. But I think in the long run, we need to rely to a certain extent on state aid. It's really the extra money that, as the economy grows, gives us the capacity to either expand programs or continue to pay our staff adequately. But you also have to temper it and realize that that's not always going to be there. And that's why, I say, getting back to reserve policies, I think you have to, sometimes you have to think of it as the 7 fat years and the 7 lean years. You have to realize that the state's going to do as much as it can when it can, but inevitably it's going to have to cut back, and then we have to have the resource capacity within the town to shelter ourselves for those days.
And the state has the same problem.
Well, sure.
So the question is how to mesh the political with the administrative. Obviously, the administrative is a reflection of the policies of the various towns and the community at large. In Amherst, we're big on having a say about how we think our government should run and what its priorities. And I put that out intentionally because I think one of the big challenges for anybody in administration is to work closely with the community, work closely with the policies emanating from the community that go to the select board, and advocating for the towns, because that's where we have a big gap. Because sometimes we don't know until the very last minute whether or not we're going to have a significant part of our budget covered by the. So we have. There's room. I think what I'm trying to say is, we have to put their feet to the test in terms of state government. We have wonderful representation, but we need to. We can't go from year to year wondering what's going to happen with the state. We need to talk about where the priorities need to be, and we're affected. We're not an island.
That's right.
What's coming up for you in the next month or two in preparation for finance, for budget?
Well, this time of year we are starting the process for the next year's budget, for the FY13 budget. So, even though we just started FY12, you always have to be thinking ahead. So we're closing the books on FY12, figuring out what our final numbers were for revenue for the past year, and that will be a guide to adjusting what revenue we think we're going to have in the coming year. So I'll be looking at revenue forecasts, and in September and October start to go public with some of those numbers so that the community can have some sense of where we stand. One of the things that we'll always be looking at is health insurance costs. That's a big issue, and as you probably know, there have been some big recent changes at the State House about how cities and towns provide health insurance to their employees. It's one of our biggest cost centers. So we have to look at it, I think, both from a cost point of view, but also be mindful that the town has had, I think, a long and successful relationship with its unions, that it's important to keep that dialogue open and positive. So we've made changes over the years, and that's been very positive for the town. I think more change will be coming in the future, but doing that in a way that we're talking with the unions about it is key. And then I think one of the big issues that we need to look at is making sure we're continuing to invest adequately in our infrastructure. One of the things that often gets cut when budget times are tight is capital. And the town, I think, has done a pretty good job of spending on capital, although I think there's probably room for improvement in that area. So those are three big issues I'm looking at now.
So are you bringing up probably one that's close to many of us in the town? The relationship that we have with employees has been outstanding as community members, police, fire department.
Oh, yeah.
And as I said on previous shows, I made good use of the fire department. It's got a wonderful response, has a wonderful response to the needs of particularly injured and ill residents. But we're also not, as I said, not living on an island. And we have Wisconsin and other examples of when things get tough, government tends to forget about, government meaning leadership, tends to forget about the contributions that employees make every day to year to create the kind of service that we have for this community. And we're not going to be exempt from pressures to go in that direction. I think for the record, we ought to point out, and you're probably in the best position to do it, the sacrifices that town employees have already made over the years, including teachers. I wonder if you would enunciate that a little bit.
Well, I have seen a history of cooperation. For example, in recent years, people have had to take very modest or no pay increases, and that's really a change from the norm. But it's been worked out successfully, and I think that's made a huge difference to the town's ability to maintain core services. The same thing in the area of health insurance. We have made changes to things like co-pays for doctor's visits or drug co-pays and so forth to keep them at least competitive with what's out in the market so that they remain affordable. And I know in this FY12, that's been a huge change for us. It's allowed us not to be able not to raise our rates this year for the second year in a row, because we've made I think rational and mutually beneficial changes to some of the benefits we offer. And that's just not possible to do if you don't have a good relationship with your union. So they deserve a lot of credit for coming to the table and being understanding and looking out for the interests of the town as a whole.
And they're also members of the community. They pay taxes. So we're talking about the security of the economy of this town. It's dependent on people.
That's right.
People who work at the college, people who work for town government, people who work in the jobs throughout the area. And so those issues are, and that's why we're into concern and growing concern about unemployment and people losing their homes, which seems to be growing, not abating. An issue that's close to my heart is the health care. As you know, the members in this community have been fighting for years, and we've had proposals and resolutions at town meeting for a single-payer health care system, which brings to mind what I said earlier about if we're going to make significant change, that's going to be in the direction of financial independence from the medical industry in some cases. We're going to need to explore moving in the direction of changing policy at the state and federal, and today there's a movement to develop a single-payer system right here at the state level because the federal government is far away from doing anything like that. They got deficits on their mind that they created, but people have the responsibility of solving their problems. And one of the things that we have, in terms of historical perspective, one of the things we did in this town was to look at the Canadian approach to, and that we are one of the few towns that have taken advantage of buying our drugs directly from Canada, the same drugs that are purchased in the United States, made in the same factories, supervised by FDA. So there's no question about responsible medications. We've saved, I don't keep close contact, I don't watch it very closely, but I know we're saving somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000. Mm-hmm. And is that a successful program in your eyes?
It is a successful program. I had it in Newton. We have it here in Amherst. I think it's a great program. As you say, the drug pricing policies in this country don't make any sense. Other countries are able to regulate the cost of drugs in an appropriate way, and in this country, the political pressure to do that from the drug industry has prevented that from happening. So going to Canada, or we actually get our drugs from Canada. Some of them come from United Kingdom, some come from Australia, some come from New Zealand.
But they're through one source.
They are through one source.
So that it's economically feasible.
That's right. I think that what will be interesting to see in that program in the next few years is there are a number of key drugs, such as Lipitor, that are becoming generic. And so they will no longer, the economics will no longer make sense to buy them from Canada because you'll get them as a generic version in the States. So it'll be interesting to see how many drugs we'll continue to buy from abroad, but as long as we can save some money and get people safe and reliable drugs from Canada and similar countries, it's a great program. About 10% of our enrollees in health plans in the town enroll in that program right now.
So there's room for growth.
There's definitely room for growth.
What's the advantage to the town, and what's the advantage to the employee to sign up with the Canadian program?
The advantage to the town is that when we buy the drugs through Canadian providers, the overall cost to the town healthcare trust fund is lower than if we were having to buy them through the United States. The advantage to the employees is that they basically get the drugs for free. They don't pay any copay. It's an incentive to them to use the Canadian system. And when you factor in all of those dollars, even if when the town's losing those copays, we overall make money on the system. So it helps keep the town's costs down. It helps keep our employees, and in particular our retirees, costs down, which is something that we take very seriously. And so it's a win for everybody.
So are our seniors, our retirees taking advantage of this program?
Yes, as again, I think overall 10% of people who are eligible to get health insurance from the town, whether they're active or retired, are in it. I don't happen to know what percentage of them are retirees, but you tend to think it's higher just because the kind of drugs that you can get through the Canadian system are maintenance drugs, the ones you take,
Exactly. And we don't need the Canadian program for the kinds of prescriptions that don't require major drug identifiers, like Lipitor is an example of one that's going to be coming off the market and made available in a short time. Is there room for more enrollment, in your view?
Oh, sure. I would.
What's the potential for growth there?
Well, I think to be realistic, you could probably go up another 5 or 10%. Just from my experience seeing other programs around the state. So I think we'll continue to work with our employees and with the unions to get the word out to try to do that.
It's in their interest. It's
Absolutely.
as taxpayers, it's in their interest as employees.
That's right.
So good luck, because I think, you know, when we're looking for another 80,000 or 60,000 or 50,000, it might be available to us, and we don't have to go to the bank and steal it. It's been a pleasure.
Isaac, my pleasure.
I told you you were in the hot seat. welcome to Amherst. We look forward to many years together.
Me too. Thanks.
And that's it for Conversations. I want to thank the staff and the volunteers as usual. You know, we have a new name, but we're still ACTV. So get on board. Stay tuned. See you next week.